Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the recording of the Prevention of Exposure to Asbestos e-Permits webinar. Apologies that we couldn't run the webinar live last week, but due to circumstances beyond my control, such as a power outage, I'm afraid I lost power 15 minutes before it was due to start. So I'm now recording this for you, and you should all receive this, or the link to this recording very, very soon. So we're looking at prevention of exposure to asbestos. Asbestos is still a major health concern around the world. It's not usually put out as headline news, but every year 5,500 people die from diseases directly linked to exposure to asbestos. Now, I know it's different to the current situation with COVID-19, but it's about the same number of people every year that die from this that have died already this year from COVID-19 in the UK. Yet the media coverage is insignificant compared with the media coverage we are seeing for COVID-19. You know, if we compare this 5,500, last year there were 147 work-related fatalities and 500 people were killed on the roads for driving to work reasons. In summary, there's over 6 million tons of asbestos in our schools, 80% of them, in all of our hospitals in London in particular, but many of the older hospitals around the UK have asbestos too, and also in many other UK business buildings. So it's still a big concern for everybody within the industry. It's known as a stealth risk as well as a health risk. It's not deemed a significant risk to health unless it's obviously disturbed and fibers can contaminate the air that we breathe. The issue is you may not see the results of the contamination until years after the exposure. We currently hear lots of talk about the curve for COVID-19 and a 3-week period expected to go from the start to the peak. With asbestos, we're talking years. We're talking 40, 50 years sometimes that situations don't materialize within the health of individuals based on exposure all that long time ago. So we've got cases going through courts today going right back to the 70s and the 80s when the problem just wasn't recognized as it is today. Precautions are rightly taken by all organizations now to protect employees. And the issue is, as I said earlier on, you won't see the effects of these precautions for years. So we won't know if what we're doing now will actually have an effect by flattening the curve, a term that we're all now very, very aware of, until a long time, 40 years after the initial contamination. So it's a major issue and a long burn concern for everybody in the industry. The Control of Asbestos Regulations have a certain number of areas that are pertinent to what we need to look at. The first one is that duty holders must assume there is asbestos present in every building, even in buildings that were built after the year 2000, unless there is absolute evidence that there is not. Now, this actually raised a question from one of our e-permits users, a gentleman named Steve Case of Digital Realty. He sent a question through when this webinar was first announced and asked if we could address this. And it's quite long, so we're going to address it in stages. Steve's question was, experience tells us that buildings of a certain age, i.e. over 2000, still contain traces of asbestos left in materials used by unscrupulous builders. The buildings in the last 20 years have undergone significant changes and refits. However, records tend to tail off, have never been considered or lost in change of occupancy. It would be good to understand clearly the obligations of a new owner or new tenant towards surveys, management processes, and the such like, as intrusive surveys are sometimes critical environments can be both expensive and a logistical nightmare. Those are the exact words that Steve used in the questions. I've replicated as it is. Okay, so Regulation 4 of CAR 2012 states that the duty holder should presume materials contain asbestos unless there is strong evidence that they do not. And it doesn't differentiate between buildings built before the year 2000 or afterwards. The law is clear also with respect to the determination of asbestos in non-domestic buildings. The duty holder must carry out sufficient and suitable assessments to determine the presence of any asbestos on the premises, hence surveys. The duty holder can be an owner, a tenant, or a premises controller under Regulation 4, and that means the person or the organisation that has clear responsibility for the maintenance or repair of non-domestic premises through an explicit agreement such as a tenancy agreement or a contract. With regard to the legal position, the extent of the duties depend on how much control is retained under the lease. Where a whole building has been leased on a full repairing and insuring basis, in practice there is very little the landlord will be expected to do. Compliance with health and safety law rests with the tenant. So here's an industrial example that was brought up to us. A building was built in 2004, therefore should not have had any asbestos presence, but we nevertheless had to examine a detailed raft of relevant documents to establish that no ACMs were present in the building. At the end of the process, no ACMs were found, but the assessment work had to be done. The trigger for that assessment work was a prospective tenant who wanted to be sure there were no ACMs on the premises. We had to check through all the construction documentation produced under CDM, including the architect's records, to be sure. Now, this example may seem contradictory to the assertion referenced in the previous slide, but it suggests that a prospective tenant stroke new owner should take the opportunity to ensure the absence of asbestos from the landlord or the previous owner prior to signing the tenancy purchase agreement. The two things do tie together. The previous slide says that it can be down to the tenant to be the one that's responsible, but if before the tenant takes the building, he ensures that the landlord provides the information that proves no ACMs are present, then they are covered. So if we go back to the Control of Asbestos Regulations, in addition, every employer must prevent exposure to asbestos in as far as is reasonably practical. If it's not reasonably practical, then they must ensure exposure is at the lowest level possible by means other than the use of respiratory equipment. Ensure that the number of employees exposed to asbestos is as low as reasonably practical. And where it is not reasonably practical, employers must have the appropriate work processes and engineering controls in place and use suitable equipment, materials, and approved PPE, including full respiratory control, to control any exposure at source. Reasonably practical, two words used all the way through those regulations. How do you define reasonably practical? From an HSE perspective, it means that when you're determining what's reasonably practical, you should take into account the likelihood of the hazard or risk occurring, the degree of harm from the hazard or risk, and knowledge about ways of eliminating or minimizing the hazard or risk. And there are two terms that cover this off, ALARP, as low as reasonably practical, and SFAIRP, so far as is reasonably practical. And they're effectively the same thing, describing the level to which we expect to see workplace risks controlled. So how do you bring about this level of consistency? The regulations state that the asbestos register must be kept up to date. Companies undertaking the work must have current and up-to-date licenses in place. Risk assessments must be current and valid and reviewed regularly. PPE must be suitable and applicable. A competent person must be in charge of the work, and suitable provision of information given on the relevant permits to work for that competent person. And training in all required areas must have been completed by everyone undertaking the work. And the records must be audit trailed and retained for a period of 40 years. So these are the objectives, and they can be measured. For asbestos registers, records can be kept, updated, and tracked. Companies undertaking work that have up-to-date licenses, again, records can be kept, updated, and tracked. Risk assessment, records can be kept, updated, and tracked. PPE can be specified and checked. The competent person can be checked in terms of their training and competency. Records could be checked and updated and tracked for all people that are coming on site with regards to their training and competencies. And of course, the records retained for 40 years in terms of storage. So consistency is key. These are all objective measurements, and we can use systems to manage them. So we can keep all the records in one place, training and competency, audit trails, and so forth. We can ensure that all records are up to date and provide adequate warning of expiry. By monitoring expiry dates, systems can indicate to people when those expiry dates are approaching. We can stop the process of requesting or planning work for any non-compliances. So again, if something has gone out of date, if someone's training is now expired, systems should stop the process of requesting work done by that individual or that company. Systems can ensure that records are accessible through suitable processes. It can ensure that automatic warnings are given if work is in the vicinity of asbestos by tying in the work that's to be done with knowledge of the asbestos register and where asbestos is located in the building. It can ensure that correct PPE is worn at the point when the work starts. So again, kit checks on people when they arrive to do the work. Is the kit that they have brought with them specified in the RAMs or specified as specified on the permit to work? Can ensure that any warnings are clear on the permit to work documents and ensure that safety checklists are completed and signed off at the point of work. Finally, you can retain records for any specified period for future review. So systems can manage all of these requirements for asbestos and remove the risk of paper being used around an organization and having to then find that paper should there be an issue that comes up. If something does come up, for example, now, it's likely that any issue with regard to an asbestos-related disease could have been instigated 30 or 40 years ago. Just imagine what you would have to do if you had to go back to look for records that are 30, 40 years old and try and prove that everything was done that should have been done to minimize the risk. E-permits is a system that actually help manage that in terms of its asbestos permits and the specific asbestos module that we provide within the system. The asbestos module in e-permits is provided at no cost. So any clients that take e-permits that have asbestos present on site, they will have the module switched on at no cost to ensure they're able to manage the asbestos permitting side of work that's to be done. Now, I'm not going to take you through this flowchart. It just shows you how the e-permit system goes through the process of meeting all of those requirements specified in that 2012 regulations. It's going to be far easier for me to actually show you how e-permits goes about managing asbestos permits within the system, and what I will do now in terms of a demonstration of the system for you. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run a very simple scenario where we're going to create a permit to do some work. We're going to remove some ceiling tiles, and I'm going to require an asbestos permit to go through the process. To remove ceiling tiles, in reality, we would obviously need something like steps and ladders or a work at height permit, but I'm going to circumvent that in this example just for simplicity, just to keep things quick. So as a contractor, I know that I'm coming in to do this work. I'm going to be removing some ceiling tiles. and I'm going to create a request for a permit. So I'm coming into work in this place called Custom Office. I'm coming into work for the FM company, and now I need to put in a works order number. And who am I sending as my competent person? Now, I'm picking this chap called Steve, and I'm picking another chap called Frederick to come alongside him. We can add vehicle registration numbers for security purposes. And when am I going to be doing the work? I'm going to be doing the work on 15th. I'm going to start at 9. I'm going to finish on the same day and finish at 5. The system does understand shifts, so if there are certain activities that can't go over shifts, the system will either automatically split permits up into a permit per shift or throw up warnings that it's going over a shift. What do you need to do about it? Now, you can obviously embed rules in the system that says if you're going to be doing any asbestos work, typically there needs to be a lead time on that. Normally, you might put a couple of days lead time in for doing PPM work. So contractors need to submit permit requests a couple of days before. You can add rules within any permits that says for asbestos-related work, there must be a 3-week period that you have to submit the permits, permit requests for, and it goes through the approval process. But again, that's entirely up to you and how you manage your systems. So I've said I'm coming in to do some removal. So I'm removing and I'm going to be taking away some ceiling tiles. So I'm disturbing the fabric. I look to see if I have RAMs. Yes, I have got RAMs in there that covers this particular activity. So these have been submitted to the company by myself as the contractor in the past, and you have approved them, so they're now already in the system. And I'm working in this particular boiler room. The system now understands where that boiler room is. It's part of a group called Engineering Plant Rooms and exists in the basement. And I'm going to add whatever information I want to put within here that will appear on the permit. So why is the work being done? It's a fault within the building, and as you can see here, we've got an asbestos. This has already been ticked because the system knows already that asbestos exists in this particular part of the building. So therefore, I can't change that. That will always be flagged up. So whatever work I'm coming in to do, whether I was just doing some electrical work or I was doing some repair work, it would always flag up to me that asbestos is going to be present within the system. So I can now move on to the next step. And so it's telling me that I need to, am I going to be disturbing the fabric of the building? Well, yes, I am. And this is the asbestos module now coming into play with an e-permit. So am I going to disturb the fabric of the building? Yes, I am. Have I had a survey provided to me by the host? Yes, I have. And I have that survey document on my system. So I can now upload that survey document. So there's the document now uploaded into the system. What type of work is to be carried out? Let's say it's going to be licensed work carried out. What type of RPE is going to be used? We're going to be using full face. And have I got an HSE reference number? Yes, and that's been put into the system. Here we have a PPE module, and I can actually start to specify the type of PPE that I'm going to be using. So for the asbestos side of things, I'm going to be wearing self-contained breathing apparatus. And for normal access to site, I need a safety helmet, I need safety boots, and I need a high-vis jacket. Now, this is in addition to the information that will be on the RAMs. This is the PPE module within e-permits that allows you to specify these. So, for example, if these were standard that had to be for every contractor, you could put those in and they could be set as default values. And the contractor can then add any other things that they want to be bringing on site. Otherwise, the contractor fills in what it is they're going to bring in, and you'll see later in the process when you come to receive the permit request and you're going through the approval process, you have the opportunity to change those. So I can now submit that permit request, and I have an access permit from 9 o'clock until 5 o'clock on Wednesday the 15th, and I have an asbestos permit, and let's say we're not going to be disturbing that till 10 until 5. So if I now submit that permit request, I now have some requests out there awaiting approval, and there are my permit requests for an access permit and an asbestos permit. And that has now been routed to the relevant people within the organisation. An email has now arrived in the inbox of one of the approvers, a guy called Howard Albury. These are all different approvers within the organisation, and it's for permit requests submitted by Richard De Silva. The competent person is going to be Steve Chandler, the description of the work, and so forth. I click on the link within there. I do apologise. I called up the wrong permit request there, the wrong email. This is the one that's come through. So I'm going to be removing damaged ceiling tiles in the boiler room, and the request has an access permit and an asbestos permit within there. If I click on this link, what that will do, it will take me to the login page for Howard. Howard now logs into the system as the approver, and here we have the requests awaiting approval, and here are the permit requests for an access permit and an asbestos permit. So as a reviewer and the approver of the permits, I can now look at this access permit. It gives me information about clashes. So I've actually got no activity taking place at the same place at the same time that we're planning to do this work on removing the ceiling tile. So that's good news. But if I did have other work that was scheduled in there, it picks up 3 types of clashes. Location clashes, work taking place at the same place at the same time. Service clashes, work taking place on the same piece of kit at the same time. And dependent service clashes, where one job needs an activity and another one doesn't need it. They are mutually exclusive. What will appear here would be the permit numbers and details of the permits. You can click on them, go and look at those permits themselves. They could be either in the approval stage or they could have already been approved. You then have the ability to discuss it internally to decide, can these 2 jobs take place at the same time? Yes or no? If one has to be bounced, you have the ability then to decide which one is the lower priority. You then reject that permit. An email will go back to the contractor saying that the permit has been rejected. Please rearrange the date or whatever. And that contractor will then resubmit that permit request with new dates and times on there. So there's no clashes for us to worry about. This gives us the information about what the job's going to be, who's coming on the job and when they're coming. Here's the information about the task, what's going to be done. I can go and review those RAMs if I want to, just so I can double check that they are still applicable to the job that's going to be done. If I needed to bring any isolations into place, I can bring an isolation into place here within the system. Do I want any safety precautions on the permit, on the access permit? Yes, I want to say I want a security escort required. Here's the PPE. Given the current situation, we want to make sure that people are wearing also, for example, gloves or gloves with a cuff. So I've added now to that PPE list. When the email goes back to the contractor, should it all be approved, then it will also notify them they need to bring additional PPE. So having reviewed all this information, if I'm happy, I can now approve that permit, putting in my password, which is there for Audit Trails the approval to me. So that access permit has now been approved. Now we come to the asbestos permit. This will need now approval as well. Same information about the clashes. Here's the type of work that's going to be done. I can go and look at the asbestos survey for those plant rooms and double check again myself. I can go and review the RAMs again. And here are the safety precautions these are the safety precautions that I want to appear on the permit document, so that we then have a tick list so that before we start work, we can go through that tick list. I'm happy with the PPE. Now, if I wanted to reject the permit, I have the ability here to specify the reason why I'm rejecting it and put information in this box. And this is what gets emailed back to the contractor if a permit has been rejected. If I'm going to approve, I can approve it. And those permits have now moved on to be what we call now approved permits. And here are the 2 permits that are in there. Now let's fast forward to the 15th. The contractors turn up. I have got 2 choices now that I can do. I can either print these permit documents. This will print them in a hard copy. I can then pin a copy up at the place of work. I can give the copies to the contractor. We can go through a wet signature process all the way through the job. And at the end of it, I would then need to scan that completed document and upload it into e-permits. But we also now have a electronic signatures capability, so that now the whole process can be paperless. So this is the access request. So the first thing that happens is when I turn up at the permit office desk, the first thing we want to check is, are the people the ones that you specified on the permit? If they're not, we have the ability to edit the team. And this is critical, particularly in things like high-risk activities, and in particular, asbestos. If I change the name of the person on that permit document, the system will rerun all of those training and competency checks that we did right at the beginning when we first put Frederick and Steve on the permit request. If anyone on the team no longer has the required training for the job, you will not be able to issue the permit because there is a non-compliance within that now. So the contractor would have to go back, replace that person, or do whatever's necessary to get other people on site that they can then carry out the work because they are properly trained and qualified. So that's crucial to maintaining those regulations that we saw in the presentation from 2012 about ensuring that the people have the right level of training and competency for the task. Steve Chandler, as the competent person, must be deemed a competent person for this type of work, and Frederick is also a competent person, but he is also the worker and he must have full levels of training and competency. I can review the RAMs again at this point. Again, being able to review the RAMs here means everything's in one place and accessible through one screen. I can bring in isolations if I want to. Is the security escort required? Yes. So yes, I want the security escort for this. So they're going to be taken to the place of work and security escort will be maintained all the way through the job. Kit check, please, guys. I want to see that you've got everything that you need. Yes, everything that was on the permit request you have. So I'm quite happy to now issue this permit. From my perspective, as the permit officer, the guy at the front desk, I'm happy to do this. This next stage can be done either on a tablet at the front desk or a laptop with a little signature pad, but you have the ability now to sign these permits off. So the first person that will sign off is Howard. Excuse me, I only have a mouse to use on here. I don't have one of the fancy screens that you can write on. But if you can imagine it on a tablet or an iPad, it's very simply just an electronic signature within there. So I'm now able to generate this permit. So by generating this permit, what I now produce is a PDF document that has all the signatures and associated things on there. So here we've got, here we've got the permit. There's the work order number, and we can see that we've got the security escort is required. Any comments or special requirements, I could have added that in at the approval process. And here we've got the signatures by Howard, who signed Steve in at 12:06, and we have the signature from Steve that also signed at 12:06. The grey areas here, these are liability statements. Whatever you want those liability statements to be, or you currently have on your paper permits, it can be recreated. In fact, the whole permit document, this is just our standard template. But if you already use particular permit templates and you want to retain the use of those, we can replicate your permit templates within ePermits, and therefore all the information that we produce is then populated within your template in the appropriate places. So that is the interim permit, if you like, and that can now be emailed to Steve Chandler. So it emails him the permit, but not just the permit document, it also emails him the RAMs as well. So now on his smartphone or on his tablet, if he's challenged, he can actually show that he has the permit documents that are required and that they were signed off by the appropriate authority and he signed for receipt of them. Close that page now. That permit is now ready for issue. So Steve, you can go on site. Now I'm being security escorted on the site. So now when I actually come to the point of view of doing the asbestos permit, we're now in a position where we're going, okay, I can still review the RAMs if I want to. Steve and Howard are standing next to each other and they go through the safety checklist. Have all these things been done? And this checklist can be mandatory, yes, no, not applicable, wherever you define them to be. And obviously, just for simplicity's sake, I haven't got any restrictions around these. I can either fill them in or not fill them in. But in reality, for something like asbestos, you want an answer for each of those boxes. I still do a last-minute kit check to make sure everyone's got everything that they finally need. I can save any changes that I've made to that form, and I can now sign the form. So Howard is signing that, and Steve is picking it up. And now I can generate that permit. And that now also gives me a permit, the RAMs, and also the asbestos survey document that I can now email to Steve Chandler. So he has those now on his phone as well. So we've been through. Steve, you can go ahead and you can start work, and they are now what we call open permits within the system. So here we are, access an asbestos permit. When it comes through to the end of the job, we want to close that job off. We get to the close stage of the permit. There is a little audit that can be filled in. So if there's anything that was done that was really a non-compliance on part of the contractor, they were in the wrong place, or they were doing something outside of the RAMs, or building got damaged, whatever, you can start to tag those, and it builds up a non-compliance matrix on the contractor. You can take photographs and upload them. You can put in further information within here if there were any non-compliances. So, for example, in this example, once the ceiling panels have been taken down, it's obviously going to say in the RAMs that these ceiling tiles need to be taken away and disposed of properly. Let's say Steve just left them in the corner and didn't take them away. You could log that as a non-compliance. It's a pretty serious non-compliance, but you could log it as a non-compliance, take a photograph as proof, and then you have that tagged against that contractor for that particular job. If we assume everything was okay, we now get to the point where we want to sign this off. So the first thing is Steve says, I finished the job, I'm now handing that back. Howard, who's reviewed the site along with Steve, can say, yes, I'm happy to accept that. So both parties have now accepted closure of that. Both parties have signed everywhere. And now if we view the final permit document, we will see from the asbestos permit, there's all the electronic ticks in the boxes that we did, and there are all the signatures in place with timestamps against it. And this is the permit document that now gets archived within the ePermits records. So I can now close that permit off. Steve's happy, Howard's happy, that permit is closed off. Steve now goes back to the permit office and we can close that permit. Obviously sign the permit first, and then we close that permit off, and it's now done. Everything is now archived within the reporting system. So should I need to access information about that job years in the future, I'm actually able to go into the system, find out, show me all asbestos-related permits in April 2020. It will throw up, hopefully, just this one permit. That permit can then be reviewed. All the approvals can be seen. All the documentation, the RAMs, and everything else is visible for that purpose. So it does make it very much easier in terms of checking things from the past, particularly if it is a long, long time ago as well, rather than having to go to filing cabinets and drawers where things may have been stashed. The company could have moved offices 2-3 times in that 40-year period. Accessing the information can prove very difficult. So hopefully that has now completed the view of how e-permits actually manages the prevention of exposure to asbestos. I hope the answer that we provided to Steve Case's question gave you some useful information in some of your duties of care that you'll have to take in order to ensure that everything is above board with regard to asbestos in the building. But the key thing to take away is it doesn't matter how long ago or how recently the building has been put together, you need to have the information and the documentation that proves there is either no asbestos present, or worst case, you have to assume always there is asbestos present and take all the suitable precautions and do all the relevant surveys. If you can ensure there is no asbestos present in the room and have it documented at the beginning, you will save lots of time and lots of money not having to have surveys done continually. So I hope that's been of interest to you. Thank you very much indeed for your time. You will be emailed the link to this webinar if you're on the list of registrants. I know we had nearly 60 registrations for it last week. So again, I apologize to all those people that turned up at the appointed time, only to find that I wasn't there. But hopefully the recording will suffice in the interim. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Goodbye.